Welcome to episode 8 of The Catch Up, a podcast from the Daily Catch where we take you inside the news. My name is Walter Mullin, and I'm the publisher of the Daily Catch.
And I'm Emily Sachar, the editor of the Daily Catch.
In this podcast, we discuss stories that have appeared in the Daily Catch. We give you insights into how we put the stories together, offer additional observations, and discuss where these stories may be headed as we move forward. Emily, let's catch up.
Let's do it.
So normally we try and talk about 2 or 3 different topics on each podcast, but today we're going to devote the entirety of the podcast to just one story, which is sort of dominating our local news cycle, and that's the town board election in Red Hook.
That's right.
And as I said last week, democracy is alive and well and kicking up a storm in our little town. So let's step back and take a look at what's going on and what we can expect going forward. So there's been a lot this week on the Red Hook town board race. Let's start with the new party that's been created. Tell us how this came about and where we can expect this to move as we look forward.
Yes. So as we know, there are 2 political parties active in Red Hook. The Democrats have by far the largest share, not a majority, but a plurality. I forget the number. I think it's about 44% of registered voters are registered Democrats. And then we have a small, roughly 21% group of people who are Republicans. But there's a large swath of voters, and this is true in Rhinebeck as well, who are independents. Now, there is no longer an independent party in the state of New York, and there are no independence parties that just exist. So if one wants to file to run, one has to create petitions and get signatures. I believe the number is 264 signatures. The 2 candidates who ultimately won the Democratic caucus, Kristina Dousharm and farmer Ken Migliorelli, were not sure that they would be victorious at the Democratic caucus, and we'll get more to that later. So they did something very strategic and clever. They petitioned and had those signatures created, had those signatures developed to mount an independent party. And the name of their party is Homegrown Red Hook. They were doing this as a wager that in case they did not win the caucus, one or both of them, they would still have a way to run for election in November. So their party will appear on the line no matter what, on the ballot, no matter what happens with the Democratic caucus and the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party for that matter as well.
So are they going to run as independents, part of this Homegrown Red Hook party, or are they going to run as Democrats?
They are definitely going to be running as independents, but we don't know what's going to happen with the Democratic line at this moment because there are stories we should talk about separately about the caucus. They were elected to be on the Democratic line for the caucus as well. And if the caucus holds, we will see their names, if you vote in Red Hook, as Democrats and also as independents. But no matter what happens with the Democratic situation, they are assured a line as independents.
So let's
of course, I should add, Walter, that Democrats, Republicans, independents, it doesn't matter what your political party is for the November election. You can vote for whomever you want.
So let's step back for people who may not know about the recent caucus that took place and do sort of a high-level summary of the caucus and where exactly we are now. And my observation is the caucus has been very confusing for a lot of people. So I think we should try and walk through it very slowly.
It is so confusing. First, why we even have a caucus instead of a primary. But let me first tell you where we are. So today is June the 10th. On May 31st, a Democratic caucus was held. It was held at the Red Hook Community Center, and 3 names were put into contention for 2 open seats on the town board. Those open seats were created because incumbent Christine Caine is up for re-election, and she is competing. So that was one of the 3 names. Julia Solomon also would have been an incumbent, but decided not to run. So we have an open seat to fill, occupied by nobody. And then, as I say, we have Christine Caine's seat. So we had Christine Caine running, and then Kenny and Kristina Dousharm. So 2 Christines also, which makes it a little confusing. We have Christine Caine and Kristina Dousharm.
And
so
just
3 people were up for election.
And just to paint a very clear picture, because it's part of the story, the caucus took place, it started when and ended when?
Yeah, it's very important. I'm glad you asked. It started at 4 o'clock and it ended roughly at 6 or 6:30. When we say started, what that means is that the Red Hook Community Center then opened its doors to people who wanted to come and participate in the caucus. And there were very specific rules about participating. You had to live in Red Hook and be a registered Democratic voter in Red Hook. You can't come in and be a Republican living in Red Hook. You can't come in, live in Red Hook and be from another party. You can't come in as a Democrat from Rhinebeck and even watch it. So there was a process to check people in. And then at 4:30, thereabouts, 4:33, the doors were closed to the building room where this was being held. As I said, it was at the Red Hook Community Center. The doors were closed and the process of the caucus itself then began.
But that's an important point. We have to just stop here for a minute. At 4:30, they chose to not admit any more people into the room.
That's right. And one of the matters of contention is whether that was fair. It may have been legal. It may have been within the rules. It may have been within the allowed permissible actions that the chair could take, but people feel it wasn't fair. And they felt it wasn't fair that night because what happened, Walter, is there was a sign, there were notices, legal notices placed all over town and sent to Red Hook Democrats as well, saying the caucus is running from 4 to 6. It sounded a little bit like getting a party invitation. Come from 4 to 6. And if you read the fine print of an email that was sent by the Democratic Committee chair, you would have known that at 4:30, that's when the voting was going to be taking place, or not even the voting. The formal caucus would begin at some point, possibly before 4:30, likely no later than 4:30. But it wasn't clear that when the caucus started, you would not be admitted after that. You couldn't sign in. You couldn't then become eligible to vote.
And do we know why they stopped admitting people at 4:30?
They wanted to start the caucus. They wanted to close the doors so that they weren't having Republicans. They weren't having people from Rhinebeck. They wanted to have what's called a closed caucus.
But hold on, those people would not have been allowed in the door anyway.
Right. But I'm saying they wanted to close the doors and they wanted to move on to the next part of the caucus. And the woman who's in charge of it is permitted to do and run her caucus as long as she follows certain criteria. For example, assuring that the people who vote in the caucus are registered Democrats. She has leeway in terms of how, we believe, she has leeway in terms of how she logistically runs the caucus, right?
So now let's talk about what happened after 4:30 at the caucus.
So after 4:30 at the caucus, people's names were put into nomination. So there was a nomination for Christine Caine, and then there was a second for the nomination, and then Christine Caine made a speech, or a short speech. Same with Kristina and same with Kenny, with one exception being that because he is not a registered Democrat, Kenny Migliorelli was not allowed to speak on his own behalf.
Let's hit pause there for 1 minute. So Ken and Kristina created this new party called Homegrown Red Hook. Ken is not a registered Democrat, and yet he was allowed to walk through the door.
He was allowed as a matter of courtesy because he had advised the Democratic Party in advance that he was going to be a contender. He was allowed to come into the room until the caucus. My understanding is, I actually wasn't there, but my understanding is that he was allowed to go into the room, but then was asked to leave. And I don't know whether he was asked to leave at the 4:30 mark or when his name was put into nomination. It's sort of academic, really. He wasn't allowed to stay in the room. His speech, or his acceptance speech, if you want to call it that, was read by somebody else. He didn't read it himself or state it himself.
Understood. So the results of the caucus were?
There were a total of 416 votes cast out of a possible total of 484. That's 242 people times 2 would have been 484, could have been cast. Kristina got 179 votes. Ken Migliorelli got 126 votes. And Christine Caine got 111 votes. So she was 15 votes shy of being in second place, or tying, and 16 votes shy of winning a spot.
Just to put this evening in perspective, the turnout for the caucus was extraordinary.
Extraordinary. We haven't been able to confirm if it was a world record, or a Red Hook record across the decades. We know that in the last 10 years, there's been nothing like this. The normal number of people who turn up at a caucus, I've been told, is about 50 to 70. So this was way, way, way out there, 3 to 4 times the norm.
Okay, so let's keep moving. So everyone goes home and goes to bed, and then we all wake up on Monday, June 2nd. And what happened starting the week of June 2nd?
Okay, so June 2nd is actually a very important date. That's the date that the Red Hook Democratic Party filed the result of the caucus with the County Board of Elections. And that sets off a clock. And that clock is that within 3 days, anybody who wants to file objections to the caucus must do so. And that, in fact, happened. 3 people filed objections to the caucus. And we only know because we've only been able to interview one of the 3, but her objection centered on that issue about the time that we just discussed. This was Dr. Maura Sullivan, a former president of the Red Hook Education Foundation, a noted member of our community, a Democrat. She was angry, and she apparently had been angry that evening, that she was not allowed to enter the caucus and vote after that 4:30 door closing moment.
So she's one of those people who arrived after 4:30 and the plane had pulled back from the gate, as it were, and she could not get on the plane.
Great analogy. Couldn't get on the plane. Left frustrated and began to comment on it in social media, and then filed a formal objection to the validation of the caucus result.
And then the other 2 objections, we
other 2 objections, we know who they're from. We've reported this, but we don't know why specifically they objected. But we will know why tomorrow. If they want to follow up, they need to file specific objections, and they can come up with all kinds of things that are violations in their view of the law. There is a almost 1,000-page election law, and inside that election law, there are several pages that outline all the rules and precautions and procedures that must be taken to file to host a caucus, run a caucus, and register the result of a caucus. And the Daily Catch exclusively was able to report that there was a serious procedural error. Now, when I say serious, I just mean that it was a breach of the law from what we've been told. That doesn't mean that it will invalidate the caucus, but it does mean that there was an error. And that error, are you on pens and tenterhooks waiting to hear it, is that the notice to host the caucus and hold the caucus needs to be filed with the Dutchess County Board of Elections and entered into, I presume, a computer system. The notice also has to be posted on a bulletin board, and it must be posted in that time frame. So 10 days before the caucus, it must be posted. So the caucus was held on May 31st. By May 21st, and maybe it's 10 business days, it needs to be up on that bulletin board. And as far as we know, it never was placed up there.
Where does this all-important bulletin board live?
In Poughkeepsie at the Dutchess County Board of Elections office. It's apparently on the first floor, and we have a photograph that shows other caucuses that are posted there, including the Red Hook Republican caucus, but no sign that we know of, that we see, of the Democratic caucus.
Who figured out that this piece of paper did not go up on this now critical bulletin board?
That is a very important question, and one to which we don't have the answer. I mean, we know because we've reported it. We have sources, anonymous sources who we will not identify at this time, who know that the caucus was not posted correctly. That's how we wrote our story. We don't know exactly why this happened or how it happened or ultimately who was responsible. The buck stops with the Democratic Elections Commissioner. There are 2 commissioners, one for the Republicans, one for the Democrats. Interestingly, no commissioner for independents. That's a whole nother story for another day. But no Democratic commissioner that we know of, Lisa Jessup, posted the notice or assured that it was posted.
Okay,
now,
so
that doesn't mean Just let me add one other thing here. That doesn't mean that the three objectors will file that specific complaint tomorrow. And my understanding is that if they don't, then unless they file something else that's considered a so-called fatal flaw, the caucus might not be invalidated. But if they consider that to be a fatal flaw, or if they find other examples of other procedural defects that they consider to be fatal flaws, then the caucus may be invalidated.
It's astounding to me in this day of digital media that a little bulletin board in Poughkeepsie is potentially upending this entire process.
It's shocking, isn't it? It's such a vestige of the past. But there are people who feel that it's very important that those notices are there. There are people who come in and look at them. You and I may not be among them, but perhaps the Republican Party wants to look. Perhaps somebody from another town wants to know if there's a caucus in Red Hook. So this is a central hub where such notices are placed. And until it's excised from the law, it has to be followed. And my belief, Walter, knowing how well this caucus was managed, is that the Democratic leaders in Red Hook got that notice down there and had every expectation that this was a small procedural detail that would be followed up on with correction on time. So must be very upsetting to those people to see, as you say, that this caucus may be upended when certainly they intended to follow this rule.
I'm confused by one thing. I want to circle back. We have three people who stood up and said, I object on June 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is happening tomorrow with those three? They have to file?
So, good question. They file what's called a general objection. We actually ran photographs of these in the Daily Catch. It has their name, their address, which of course we excised, the address of the Board of Elections, and it states, I believe, the event that they are contesting. But then they have 6 days from that moment to file their specific objections. So they must file something that is legal breaking. They must have shown something was done procedurally that is in violation of the election law, right? They can't just say, I don't like that the director of the caucus wore a purple polka dotted dress. It didn't adhere to my taste. Or I don't like that they didn't have an American flag in the room. There's very specific things that they must look at to find their objections, and then they must file that objection and write it down. So that's what we're waiting for next.
And we'll learn that tomorrow.
We will learn tomorrow. We will be on. I don't know if we will learn tomorrow. They will file by tomorrow. We will have to see when the Board of Elections posts it.
Or they could choose not to file.
That's right. They could choose not to file.
So when will we learn about the bulletin board, the now infamous bulletin board?
The very famous bulletin board with the blue wall behind it. We will find out whenever the Board of Elections notifies, whenever they post it on their website. So the objectors will file their complaints by tomorrow, but that doesn't mean that paperwork will be uploaded for our visible purposes, for us to see it.
Let's talk through possible next steps. Possible next step number one is the caucus results stay as they are and life goes on.
That's right.
And that would be the committee says these three objectors were not serious errors, and the bulletin board problem goes away.
Let me elaborate a little bit on that. So as I mentioned, there are two elections commissioners. There's the Democratic election commissioner and the Republican election commissioner. And an answer that I cannot give you right now because I do not know is what happens if the Republican commissioner, who also has to rule on this, is my understanding, feels that this is a fatal flaw, and the Democratic commissioner feels it's not. What happens then? Who makes that tie break? If they both agree that this is so specific and so, hold here, and so easy to guarantee, so easy to see, so verifiable, that this is so verifiable, they both will likely have no choice, right, but to invalidate the caucus. And then the question is, what happens after that? So
Will
you
they-
said
will
if they
they-
don't invalidate it, then everything's easy. If they do invalidate it, then what happens?
If they do invalidate, will they hold another caucus?
We don't know. My understanding from Michael Dupree, the Dutchess County Democratic Committee chairman, is that it is up to the Democratic Committee chair, Sarah Imboden, to decide whether or not to hold another caucus. There is time. They have until July 24th to schedule a caucus. So she has the time to set one up. Presumably, she can find a venue. Presumably, she can advertise it, post the notices all over town, make sure that it's time that it's posted at the election board.
And I would suggest not locking the doors at 4:30.
Well, since the caucus is suspect by a number of people in the community for this closing the doors problem, if she holds another caucus, I would imagine she will be very, very clear in the notices about exactly what's going to happen when. And she'll make sure that it's clear that if you're not there by a certain time, you're not getting in the room, right? But some people have said, well, why hold another caucus, right? She has a result. Why do that? Others say, when people feel disenfranchised, it's not a good way to end the election season. And this is an opportunity, or could be an opportunity, to correct that malady that belabors this caucus, which is that it feels to some, probably not all, but it feels to some like there was a disenfranchisement that occurred here.
If there's another caucus, I suspect everyone's going to be down looking at that bulletin board in Poughkeepsie, making sure the piece of paper. What's driving the July 24th date?
It's just a deadline on the election calendar. That's the date by which I presume it has to do with getting the ballots printed. You know, they have to lock down what the ballot is. So they can't let this just go on and on and on. We have a November ballot, and there's an election calendar that's published by the State Board of Elections, and there are certain dates you have to hit. And that's the last date by which a caucus can be held. Now, we're having a June 24th primary, something we haven't talked about. It's too late to get on the primary ballot. So this particular Red Hook Democratic Committee has approved a caucus system. Had they wanted to have a primary, they would have had to have gotten that motion, that wheel in motion, much sooner than they did now. It's too late.
But the June 24th primary is not for the Red Hook Town Board election.
That's exactly right. But it is for the Troy Haley and Christopher Munn race. We've talked about it in other podcasts. So had they decided to have a primary, we could have had a primary for town board too. There's nothing precluding town board from being on the primary ballot previously, but now it's too late for that. In fact, Rhinebeck has primaries for their town board races.
That's what's confusing, I think, to a lot of listeners and readers, is it's done one way in Rhinebeck, it's done this way in Red Hook, and it just seems very confusing.
It is. It's very confusing. Caucuses in and of themselves are confusing. People aren't used to that, right? We do primaries on a regular basis. We do regular elections. We do school board elections. People know, go to the polls, vote, get an absentee ballot if you're not going to be in town. You have from, typically noon to 9 in our community to vote if it's a school board election, 6 to 9 if it's a general election. People have these sort of timers built into their body clock when there's an election season. The caucus is just kind of comes out of nowhere for people. So, and because they're not typically contested elections, people don't have to pay super close attention to that, right? They don't, there's no one I'm interested in voting for, or I don't really care. It's actually a kind of apathy that develops when you have a system like this. When you have something where people have to be more proactive and schedule it and know when it's happening, it makes it a little more compelling.
Could the Red Hook Democratic Committee decide after the problems this spring to walk away from the caucus format and do things differently in the future?
Yeah. In fact, Robert McCann, the town supervisor, after the caucus said, maybe it's time to have a primary system in Red Hook. I don't know what his position on that has been previously, but he did feel strongly that that's what should be done. At least he raised the question, I should say, that that's what should be done for the future. So this caucus system in Red Hook has created enough agita that I think there will be a close examination of this going forward.
So it's Tuesday, June 10th, and we're recording this podcast in the morning. When do you think we will expect a definitive answer on if the caucus results are invalidated or if they're going to hold?
I don't know. It's such an unusual situation. I don't know when the commissioners will get together to decide. Now, remember, if there are no specific objections filed by tomorrow, they don't have to decide. So we will first have to know whether those specific objections come in. I would imagine they would make their decision fairly quickly because there's a lot of things that would have to happen, a lot of decisions that would have to be made in the aftermath.
Just to be clear, we're talking about the 3 specific objections, but we're also talking about the bulletin board problem.
The bulletin board problem has to be raised by one of the objectors. So what I've been told is that they don't just drop in a problem, even if they know about it. The objectors have to raise it and say, this caused a problem for us, the fact that this bulletin board was not there. You know, you could imagine a scenario, Walter, where they say, well, we understand you're objecting and you're correct. The bulletin board notice wasn't there. But the 3 of you had access to many, many, many signs to know that the caucus was happening and so forth. So if they raise that, it's possible that there could be an argument that would be persuasive to the commissioners that it's not meaningful. We are in uncharted territory. I've never covered anything like this in Red Hook. I don't think people in Red Hook are familiar with having a situation like this. So we can't really predict what's going to happen. We don't know.
Does Christine Caine, who did not win in the caucus, does she have any ability to object or oppose?
She can be like any other objector. Anybody can object. Republicans can object, Democrats can object, independents can object. So yes, she does.
Okay. Well, I'm exhausted by all this. I don't know about you.
I'm fascinated. I'm exhausted on one level, but I think it's absolutely a fascinating situation. Just fascinating. And I think the fact that we have so many people reading our stories about this and commenting on social media and so on and so forth shows that this has really animated our town.
Well,
and that's wonderful for a community.
We also have to talk about the elephant in the room that we believe stirred up a lot of this passion, and that's the boat club story. I didn't want to talk about the boat club story again this week, but we have to touch upon it. That's part of what has riled up everyone, and maybe that contributed to the extraordinary turnout at the caucus.
Yeah, people are saying that that has really activated their sense of fairness and propriety, and they're upset at the town board, and they view Christine Caine as a member of the current town board. So even though this has been largely driven by Robert McKeon, they view Christine Caine as part of that group. They see Kenny and Kristina Dousharm as opportunities and options to overturn, if not that decision, if it should be made, overturn the approach and the process that's been used to put the boat club on the agenda. So we should have more to say on that in the coming days as well. That process about the boat club continues to move through the planning board and so forth.
Well, I hope this helped to illuminate for our listeners the story. As I said, it's confusing, so we try to just step through it slowly to understand the different moving parts.
Yes, and that's something I hope our readers come to realize we will be doing on this podcast. We will break things down in excruciating detail so they can understand what's going on, assuming we understand what's going on, Walter.
So we gave a quick glimpse into what should be coming up in this story, so more to come. And as always, keep your eyes on the Daily Catch. This week, we're going to start something different to close out our podcast, a new section called Ask Emily and Walter. We will answer questions that you, our listeners, send in to us. So please email your questions to me at walter@thedailycatch.org. Again, email your questions to me at walter@thedailycatch.org. And on future podcasts, we will answer those questions. But today, Emily, you and I are going to ask each other a question just to kick it off. And we do not know what the other person's going to ask. So I'm going to go first.
Sounds fun.
Emily, you started your career in journalism almost 50 years ago. Today, however, the media landscape for reporters is much different. Digital media is now the standard publishing format. Social media is a channel that has to be considered. And AI continues to grow and offer both advantages and perils for journalists. So here's my question for you. If you were starting out your career today in 2025 as a journalist, how would you have to prepare differently than when you started your career 50 years ago?
Oh my. Well, let's take me back 50 years ago. I didn't do a lot of preparation for my career as a journalist back then. I started working for small newspapers. I was a student at Stanford in California, and there were a lot of papers in the Bay Area. So many choices, so many places to work. And I just went and got a job at one of them and started working 20 hours a week to help my parents pay for my college. I actually don't think I would do anything that differently. I would try to get a job at a local newspaper like the Daily Catch. That's the kind of paper I worked at back then. And I would have some tools that are quite different. I would have a phone. I could tape messages and tape interviews on my phone instead of on a tape recorder, which is what I did at the time. I could probably have it transcribed in seconds instead of in many minutes. But I think the skills actually and the tools and the curiosity that are necessary to be a journalist are in play today. And maybe that's a little bit refreshing to hear if it's not a little bit unusual.
You mentioned the word curiosity. When we interview candidates to come to work for the Daily Catch, I typically ask them, what are the top 3 skills a reporter needs to have? And I look for one of those skills being curiosity. And almost every candidate we talk to does say that, because if you're not curious as a journalist, it doesn't drive your work.
That's true. Exactly. So now do I get to ask you a question, Walter?
You get to ask me a question.
So Walter, I know you live in Mullin. At least that's your mailing address. Or maybe that's not your mailing address, but that's where your physical address is. What is your favorite thing about Mullin?
I love my little country road with our neighbors. I live on a small road here in Mullin, and we have a wonderful group of neighbors. And I've gotten to know them over the years, really through just walking. When I first moved here, I didn't know any of the neighbors, and I like to walk in the morning and in the evening. And I would just walk up and down the road for exercise, and I met a lot of my neighbors. And now what we've done here is we've created a little neighborhood newsletter that I publish with a friend up the road. And that little newsletter, it doesn't compete with the Daily Catch, but that little newsletter has helped to kind of unify our little neighborhood. And it goes out to about 50 or 60 people. And honestly, people love it. We struggle for news. We struggle every issue for what to put in it. But we manage to get it out, and it's kind of a unifying force for the neighborhood. So I love my road and I love my neighbors.
That's awesome. I've actually been on your road, and it's such a beautiful road. You can climb that beautiful hill and look out at the mountains, and it's just, we live in such a beautiful, beautiful area.
Exactly. So as a reminder, please email your questions to me at walter@thedailycatch.org, and we will answer them on one of our future podcasts. This concludes this episode of The Catch Up. We hope you enjoyed listening. A big thank you to Matty Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud at Radio Free Rhinecilff for their help in producing today's episode. Emily, always a pleasure catching up.
Always a pleasure, Walter. Thanks so much.